The year did not begin with bells. It began with dust. It lay thick on the roads and fields, a pale film that dulled everything it touched. The sun rose each morning like a fixed blade in the sky, sharp and merciless, cutting down what little hope remained. Wheat stalks stood brittle and gray, snapped at the root. Orchards shed fruit before it ripened. Wells sank lower, then fell silent. By midsummer, the land no longer smelled of earth, but of ash. Europe endured the heat in stillness. No birds crossed the fields. No insects stirred in the hedges. Wind moved through villages like a stranger, lifting scraps of cloth, carrying the dry rasp of hunger. People walked slower now, not from age, but from emptiness. Church bells rang anyway. Stone churches offered shade, but no relief. Inside, the air stayed cool and wet, heavy with mold and old incense. Knees pressed against cold floors worn smooth by generations of prayer. Faces gathered in rows, hollow and streaked with grime. Cheeks clung to bone. Lips cracked. Eyes stared forward, unblinking, as if waiting for something final. Above them, painted saints flaked from the walls. Gold leaf peeled away, revealing dull plaster beneath. Candles burned down to their wicks, releasing a sour smoke that clung to hair and skin. The smell mixed with sweat and damp wool. It settled in the throat. The priest stood at the altar, thin as the people before him. His vestments hung loose, patched and faded. When he raised his hands, the sleeves slipped back, exposing wrists no thicker than rope. His voice moved through the nave, low and steady, carried by the stone. He spoke of sin without shouting, of greed, of bodies grown soft while faith rotted, of knights who rode east beneath holy banners and returned with blood on their hands and silver in their packs, of Jerusalem, lost again, not seized by force, but abandoned by grace. He reminded them of another time, of Pope Urban II, long dead now, who once stood before crowds and promised forgiveness through fire and steel. Back then, men believed heaven could be taken by force. They marched, they burned, they looted, they failed. Now the failures had come home. In the crowd, a veteran shifted his weight. Leather armor creaked faintly. Rust bloomed along the edge of his sword, still strapped at his side out of habit. His fingers twitched, then stilled. A woman nearby pressed a sleeping child tighter to her chest. The child's ribs showed through the linen. Each breath came shallow, uneven. The priest's words pressed harder as they rose. He spoke of a God who no longer listened to adults, of hands stained by gold and flesh, of vows broken not in battle, but in comfort. The holy tomb, he said, would not open to the corrupt. A murmur crept through the pews. Not protest, recognition. Outside, the heat climbed higher. Sunlight spilled through the narrow windows in hard, white bars, cutting across bowed heads. Dust drifted in the air, slow and endless. Somewhere beyond the walls, a horse whinnied, sharp with thirst. Metal rang faintly as a smith struck a blade too brittle to hold an edge. The sense of ending pressed close. It lived in the sound of empty markets and in the smell of meat gone bad. It lived in the way parents counted their children at night, fingers moving in the dark. It lived in the quiet certainty that the world had tilted off its proper course. People had spoken of the end before. Plagues, comets, wars. But this felt different. There was no sudden terror, no roaring sky. Only a long, unbroken decline. A slow stripping away. When the service ended, no one rushed for the door. They rose carefully, joints stiff, heads low. The stone floor leached warmth from bare feet. A boy near the back paused, staring at the altar, at the dark stain where wine had soaked into the cloth. He swallowed, then followed the others out. The square beyond the church shimmered in the heat. Houses leaned inward, their beams cracked, their plaster shedding like old skin. A group of knights stood near the well, armor dulled, banners rolled tight and forgotten. They did not speak. Their silence carried more weight than words. Above the rooftops, the sky remained clear, too clear. That night, smoke drifted from hearths fed with scraps and broken furniture. The smell of burning wood mixed with rot. Dogs fought over bones in the alleys. Somewhere, a bell rang again, not to call, but to count the dead. People lay awake, listening, to the wind scraping along shutters, to stomachs tightening, to the distant echo of prayers spoken too often to feel new. They waited for a sign. In the stillness, something fragile began to form. Not hope yet, more like a crack in the dark, a sense that if the world had turned away from the strong, it might still look upon the clean, upon hands untouched by blood, upon those who had not yet learned how to betray. The ground stayed dry. The sun rose again. And the ash did not settle. It began without thunder, no bells, no fire in the sky, just a boy standing alone at the edge of a field that had already given up. In the flat country near Cloyes, sheep moved like shadows across the dust. Their hooves tapped dry ground that no longer yielded grass. Etienne watched them with a staff clenched in his hand, the wood polished smooth by years of use. His feet were bare. The soil burned through the skin, but he did not shift his weight. His gaze stayed fixed on the road. A figure approached from the haze. Not hurried, not heavy. The outline wavered in the heat, robes pale with dust, steps leaving no clear mark behind. When the stranger stopped, the air seemed to tighten. Etienne's grip slackened. His breath caught. The world narrowed to the sound of his own pulse and the dry whisper of wind through thorns. Later, people would argue about what truly stood there. A holy vision, a wanderer, a trick of hunger and light. None of that mattered in the moment. What mattered was the boy's stillness as something unseen pressed into him. A certainty, a burden. His hands shook as he unfolded a scrap of cloth held tight against his chest. Stained, priest, marked with lines that looked like letters. By the time Etienne reached the town, dusk had thickened the air. Smoke drifted low from cooking fires fed with straw and broken crates. The square lay uneven beneath his feet, packed earth scarred by cart wheels and boots. People gathered out of habit more than curiosity. They always did when a child climbed high enough to be seen. The wagon groaned as he pulled himself up. Wood creaked. A wheel shifted. He stood there, thin legs braced, face streaked with dust. The paper trembled in his hands. His lips moved, though no clear words carried at first. Then something changed. The boy's posture stiffened. His spine straightened as if drawn by a wire. His eyes lifted, not to the crowd, but past them. His arms rose, not in play, but with intent. The sound that followed did not belong to a child begging for attention. It cut through the square, sharp and steady, carried on breath that should not have held such force. People leaned in. They smelled it first. Not incense, not smoke. Something raw. Sweat. Fear. Need. Faces tightened. Mouths parted. A woman pressed her fingers to her throat. A man dropped to one knee without knowing why. The words themselves blurred, but their shape remained. A promise without steel. A road without blades. A holy place opening only to hands that had never taken a life. Etienne did not shout. He did not plead. He stood and let the idea move through him. His small frame cast a long shadow across the square as the last light faded. The crowd watched that shadow more than the boy himself. Far to the east, beyond forests and rivers, another child lifted his eyes to the sky. In the German lands, near the river paths and steep slopes, Nicholas stood barefoot on stone still cold from the night. He was smaller than Etienne, younger. His tunic hung loose, patched at the seams. When the clouds broke, he squinted upward, shielding his face with one hand. The sky split clean. A shape burned through the blue. Not fire, not bird. Lines crossing lines, stark and pale, hanging in place long enough to be seen, long enough to be believed. Nicholas swayed. His knees buckled, then held. He pressed his palms together, skin chalked white. Soon he was walking. Village after village slid past beneath his feet. Gravel cut his soles. Mud sucked at his steps. He did not slow. When he stopped, it was only to lift his arms and point toward the south. His voice cracked, then hardened. People gathered. Fishermen, bakers, children with dirt under their nails, mothers with empty eyes. They heard what they wanted to hear. They followed. The movement spread without orders, like heat through dry wood. In France, the boy on the wagon became a name whispered from mouth to mouth. In Germany, the smaller boy with the burning cross drew lines across the map with his feet. They did not meet. They did not need to. The roads filled. Leather creaked as packs were pulled tight. Tin cups clanged at belts. Feet shuffled. Some laughed. Some cried. Most walked in silence, staring ahead as if afraid the vision would fade if they looked aside. No swords rose with them. No shields caught the light. Only staffs. Only bare hands. At night, fires flickered along the paths. Smoke curled into the dark. Children lay shoulder to shoulder, listening to the wind scrape through trees and the distant rush of water. They slept with smiles or with clenched jaws. Dreams pressed close. Above them, the sky stayed clear. And the voices did not stop. They left before dawn, when the air still held a trace of cold and the roads lay empty. Doors creaked open in the dark. Bare feet touched packed earth, then stone. Bundles were slung over thin shoulders, tied with rope that cut into skin. Crosses, stitched from scraps of red cloth, were sewn onto plain shirts with uneven hands. The thread showed. So did the haste. The fever moved faster than messengers. It jumped from village to village, from field to field, carried by rumor and song. By the time the sun cleared the rooftops, the paths were already filling. Children drifted in from every direction, drawn by something none of them could name. Some were barely tall enough to keep pace. Others had down on their cheeks and strength in their arms. All wore the same mark. The sound came first. Not boots, not armor, voices. They rose in rough unison, cracked and uneven, pushing hymns into the open air. The notes wavered, then locked together, growing louder with each step. The songs carried over hedges and ditches, rolled across fields stripped bare by drought. Birds scattered from the trees. Dogs fell silent. Parents stood at the edge of the road and watched. Hands hovered at doorframes. Fingers clenched and released. A mother reached out, then pulled back, pressing her palm to her chest as if steadying a wound. A father traced a sign in the air, lips moving soundlessly. Some knelt in the dust. Others lifted their children's faces to the light, memorizing them, then turned away. No one ran after them. In the towns, officials posted notices that curled in the heat. Wax seals cracked. Ink bled into parchment. The king's order traveled north and south, carried by riders whose horses showed their ribs. The decree spoke of reason, of restraint, of danger. It reached the squares too late. Children passed beneath the notices without slowing. Some could not read. Others did not care. The paper flapped and tore as the columns moved on, boots and bare soles grinding it into the road. By mid-morning, the lines stretched beyond sight. In France, the columns spilled across hills and valleys, 30,000 bodies moving as one. In the German lands, another mass pressed south, thinner but no less determined. The roads vanished beneath them. Dust climbed into the air, coating hair and tongues. The smell of sweat and wool thickened. Skin rubbed raw beneath straps. Still they walked. They looked nothing like an army. No steel, no banners of silk. Only staffs cut from green wood, only packs stitched from rags. Yet the weight of their movement bent the land. Fences sagged, fields flattened. The ground learned the shape of their feet. At the edges, adults drifted alongside for a time. A mother walked until her legs failed, then stopped, gasping, watching her son shrink into the crowd. An old man shuffled forward, then sank onto a stone, his hands shaking too hard to rise again. He stayed there long after the singing faded. The column did not slow. From above, it would have looked like a living thing. A single body, head lowered, eyes fixed forward. Not lambs, wolves moving together, driven by hunger and belief, trusting the pack to keep them safe. Each child felt less alone with every step. Each step carried them farther from home. As the day wore on, the hymns grew hoarse. Throats burned, feet blistered. Some stumbled and were lifted without pause, arms hooked under shoulders, the line bending but never breaking. When one fell behind, another closed the gap. The sun climbed higher. The road stretched on. By evening, smoke from distant villages marked the horizon. The children followed the road toward it, toward food, toward shelter, toward the promise that had pulled them from their beds. Behind them, doors stood open, hearts cooled, fields lay empty. The march did not look back. The road rose, then it did not stop rising. The heat broke first, snapping like a rope under strain. Warm air thinned, turned sharp, then vanished. Breath began to sting. Sweat dried too fast, leaving skin tight and cracked. The songs faded, not all at once, but voice by voice, until only the scrape of feet and the sound of breathing remained. The mountains stood ahead, vast and indifferent. Stone walls climbed into cloud, their faces scarred with ice and shadow. Snow clung to ledges even as summer burned the lowlands behind them. The children looked up and kept walking. Food vanished early. Bread hardened into useless lumps. Hands dug into packs and came up empty. Bells tied to staffs were traded for crusts, then for nothing at all. Hunger hollowed faces. Eyes sank back into skulls. Steps shortened. The path narrowed. Loose rock slid underfoot. A stumble sent stones clattering down into fog where the sound never returned. The air smelled of cold metal and wet stone. Wind crept along the passes, slipping under shirts, finding ribs, settling there. Fingers numbed, toes lost feeling, then burned. Night fell fast. They huddled where they could, against rock faces, in shallow hollows, beneath torn cloaks stiff with dirt, bodies pressed together, not for comfort, but for heat. The ground leached warmth through bone. Frost formed on hair and lashes. Breath clouded, then slowed. In the dark, Nicholas moved among them. His feet were blue with cold. His hands shook as he laid them on shoulders, on backs that barely rose and fell. His mouth kept moving, shaping promises meant to hold the line together. The sea waited. The water would open. Salvation lay just beyond the mountains. His eyes shone too brightly in the fireless dark. Some nodded. Some stared past him. A few did not move at all. Morning revealed what the dark had taken. Small shapes lay scattered along the slope, still wrapped in sleep's final posture. Fingers curled, knees drawn tight, ice-glazed skin left uncovered. Those who rose did so slowly, joints locked, teeth chattering until sound failed. No one lingered. The path allowed no pauses. The climb ground them down. Each day thinned the column, not by tens, but by hundreds. Slips, falls, collapses that never ended in standing again. The road marked itself with what was left behind. Cloth, shoes, bodies that became part of the stone. The mountains did not notice. From a distance, the survivors looked unreal. Walking frames draped in fabric, faces stretched tight, lips split and blackened. Faith hardened as flesh failed. The weaker the bodies grew, the fiercer the belief burned. It was the only thing that still fed them. By the time they crested the last pass, the count no longer mattered. Of the tens of thousands who had started, only a fraction stood there, swaying in the wind. 1 in 4, if that. They looked down toward the valleys beyond, toward warmer air and the promise of descent. No cheers rose. They simply began moving again. Behind them, the Alps kept their dead, snow-covered tracks. Wind erased names that had never been written. The peaks stood clean and silent, towering above a harvest already taken. The sea did not move. It lay open before them, wide and flat, breathing in slow, endless pulses. Waves slid onto the shore and withdrew again, indifferent to the thousands who had followed the roads to this edge of the world. In Marseille, the children arrived at dawn. They spilled down from the hills in ragged lines, feet swollen, skin burned dark by sun and wind. The city smelled of salt and fish and old stone baked hot. Masts creaked in the harbor. Gulls screamed overhead, sharp and mocking. The sound cut through the quiet like blades. They walked straight past the walls, straight past the markets, straight to the water. Shirts were stripped off and wrung dry of sweat. Crosses clung to fabric, faded and frayed. The first feet touched the surf and flinched at the cold. Then more followed. Ankles, calves, knees. Thousands stood in the shallows, bodies swaying as waves struck them again and again. They waited. The sun climbed. Light flashed across the water, bright enough to hurt the eyes. Salt stung open sores. Crusted lips moved in prayer. Hands clenched. A boy raised his arms until they shook. A girl dropped to her knees and pressed her forehead into the foam. Nothing happened. Hours dragged on. The tide rolled in, rolled out. The water reached the same stones, covered the same shells, left the same line of wet sand behind. The sea kept its shape. Some began to sob. Shoulders heaved. Tears cut pale tracks through grime. Others screamed toward the horizon, voices breaking into raw, wordless sound. A few cursed the sky, fists beating their own chests until skin split. Most stood frozen, staring, as if motion itself might shatter what little belief remained. Behind them, the city watched. Men leaned on oars and laughed. Women pulled children close and shook their heads. Hands pointed. Food carts rolled past, wheels rattling, the smell of bread thick in the air. Guards shouted and shoved the weakest back from the water, driving them away from the docks like strays. In Genoa, it was worse. The German survivors reached the port in smaller numbers, thin lines of bone and cloth. They came down the last road and saw the ships at anchor, black hulls rocking gently. They rushed forward, dragging their feet through sand and stones, eyes locked on the waterline. The sea stayed whole. Laughter broke out along the quay. Sailors leaned over railings, grinning. Merchants cursed at the mess left on their steps. Stones flew, not hard enough to kill, hard enough to wound. Hands grabbed cloaks and tore them away. Children scattered, slipping on wet planks, scrambling for space that did not exist. By the second day, hunger returned. Throats burned from salt and shouting. Legs trembled from standing too long in cold water. The prayers thinned, then stopped. The silence that replaced them pressed harder than any sound. Nicholas was no longer there. One moment he had stood among them, face tight, eyes darting from wave to wave as if searching for a seam. The next, he was gone. No body in the surf, no figure on the rocks, only the space he had filled, already swallowed by the crowd's anger. Some looked for him, some did not. The sea held their attention now. In Brindisi, the same scene unfolded under a different sky, the same still water, the same waiting, the same slow collapse as the hours passed, and the miracle failed to arrive. By nightfall, fires burned along the shore, not in hope, in exhaustion. Children huddled against walls and overturned boats, shivering despite the warm air. Waves whispered in the dark, steady and unchanged. The sea kept breathing. It did not open. The doors closed without ceremony. In Rome, the air was cool and dim, thick with wax and stone. The remaining children stood in uneven rows beneath painted ceilings they could barely see. Their clothes hung in strips. Feet were wrapped in rags dark with old blood. When they were dismissed, it was done with averted eyes and measured gestures. The blessing did not linger. No food followed. No shelter. They were turned back toward the roads they had survived once already. Outside, sunlight struck hard. The city moved on around them. Carts rattled. Horses snorted. The children hesitated, then began to drift away in small knots, pushed north by orders that carried no mercy. Each step home promised less than the last. Far to the west, in Marseille, the harbor filled with noise. Ropes slapped against wood. Masts groaned. Tar and salt hung heavy in the heat. 7 large ships sat low in the water, their hulls dark and wide, their decks busy with men who knew their work. The children gathered at the edge of the docks, eyes wide, necks craned, breath catching with each creak of timber. The merchants arrived clean and well-fed. Rings flashed on their fingers. Their cloaks were cut from good cloth, their boots soft and uncracked. They moved easily through the crowd, hands open, palms raised. Their presence shifted the air. Where despair had settled, motion returned. The promise spread fast. Hands grabbed hands. Laughter burst out, sharp and sudden, like glass breaking. Some fell to their knees on the planks, pressing foreheads to wood still warm from the sun. Others ran back to gather friends, dragging them forward, shouting without words. The ships were real, solid, tethered. The miracle had simply taken longer to arrive. The loading began at once. Children poured up the gangways, packs bouncing against spines, staffs clattering to the deck. Sailors shoved them forward, counting with quick glances, herding them into the holds. The air below stank of damp wood and old cargo. Light thinned to slits. Still, the children smiled. Still, they believed. When the last ropes were cast off, the harbor echoed with cheers. Oars dipped. Sails caught the wind. The 7 ships slid free of the docks and turned their bows toward open water. On shore, a few locals watched until the hulls shrank to black lines against the blue, then went back to their business. The sea was calm at first. Then the wind shifted. Clouds climbed fast from the west, low and heavy. Waves slapped harder against the sides. The decks pitched. Children clutched at railings and each other, knuckles whitening. The smell of sickness rose from the holds as the ships rolled deeper into the swell. Near Sardinia, the storm struck. Wind screamed through rigging. Sails tore loose and thrashed. 2 ships vanished into spray and stone, shattered against hidden rock. Wood split. Masts snapped. Bodies were thrown into water that closed over them without pause. The remaining 5 ships held their course. They did not turn east. Days passed. The sun returned. The sea smoothed out, wide and empty. Hunger crept back in. Water was measured out in small cups. Sailors kept their distance now, hands resting near blades. When land finally rose on the horizon, it was not the coast the children had imagined. Ports opened before them in Egypt and North Africa. Markets waited. Chains waited. The ships docked. The holds opened. The children were driven out into light too bright to look at, feet unsteady on stone. Men inspected them with quick hands and colder eyes. Prices were weighed, deals sealed. The ships unloaded their cargo and took on new goods. By the time the sails were raised again, the decks were quiet. The sea closed behind them, smooth and unmarked, as if nothing had passed over it at all. 18 years passed before the truth found its way home. It arrived without banners or songs. A single man crossed the same roads the children once filled, moving slowly now, bent beneath years and memory. His robe was worn thin. Dust clung to its hem. When he stopped in villages and monasteries, people gathered, drawn by the look in his eyes more than his words. He had sailed. He had seen. The story spread in fragments at first. Whispers carried from cloister to market, from hearth to field. The children had not reached the Holy Land. They had not vanished into glory. They had been sold. Traded in ports along the southern coast, handed over to foreign masters in exchange for silver and favor. Some listeners covered their mouths. Others turned away, faces tightening as if struck. A few asked for names. The man had none left to give. Etienne never returned. No body, no ransom. Only absence. His name faded into lists of the missing, then slipped even from those. Somewhere beyond the sea, he disappeared into the same silence that took the rest. Years later, justice found 2 men. Hugo Farius and William Porcus did not die at sea. They lived well for a time, their wealth growing, their ships coming and going. They laughed in halls where others bowed. Eventually, they reached too high. They plotted against an emperor who did not forgive betrayal. The gallows rose quickly. Ropes creaked. Crowds gathered. The men struggled when the ground dropped away, boots kicking at air that offered no hold. Their deaths were public and final. Some called it balance restored. Others watched without expression, knowing what had already been lost could not be returned. Across Europe, the land bore quieter scars. Villages shrank. Fields lay half-worked. Doors stayed shut long past dawn. Old men and women moved through empty houses, touching walls as if expecting them to answer. In some places, toys lay buried beneath dust, never taken up again. Names went unspoken. Births slowed. A generation was gone. In Rome, long after the marches had ended, the words of a pope remained, copied and recopied in careful script. They spoke of children who had risen while adults slept, of an accusation carried not by arms, but by faith. The weight of those words settled slowly, too slowly. At the edge of the continent, the sea kept its rhythm. Waves rolled in and drew back, steady and patient. On a quiet shore, water crept up over pale sand, smoothing it clean. Small footprints appeared for a moment, then blurred, then vanished entirely. The surface remained unbroken. The sea did not remember them.